Welcome back. Time now to talk about the strategies that the two competing cities in the Peloponnesian War, Athens under their great leader Pericles, and Sparta, were going to use to take on each other in the Peloponnesian War. Excuse me. The Peloponnesian War was essentially a clash not only of two specific cities with their own competing military units, but it was also really a clash of two major philosophies. As you might have gotten a hint if you saw the movie 300 and remember Leonidas' comment near the beginning of the movie about the Athenians. The Spartans and the Athenians had not a very healthy respect for each other when it came to the differing type of philosophy on life that each one held. The Athenians were considered a much more intellectually based city that certainly could turn itself to fighting when necessary, but was much more concerned with leadership in general, including from the Spartan standpoint of a rather tyrannical form of leadership, and also the ability to conduct oneself on an intellectual basis with philosophy, with trade, with commerce, and through tragedy, the dramatic arts, and other forms of the more recreational type of practices that the Spartans would probably not have held in very high regard. The Athenians, on the other hand, regarded the Spartans as a predominantly martial society in a means that really isn't to be looked upon favorably, because the Spartans, of course, were well renowned for their agoge, from dating back from their earliest days of their constitution under their legendary founder Lycurgus. Agoge refers to the special military training that boys in Spartan society had to begin undergoing starting at age 7. That included many different kinds of specialized military-style training, including but not limited to outdoor treks, nighttime hunting, survival out in the wilderness, and many other forms of very particular kinds of education that were really appropriate specifically for training as a soldier. And when you were in Spartan society, that's pretty much all you did, was you served in the military and you backed your state. So you have the Athenians on one side, you have the Spartans on the other side, and these two cities staring at each other are occupying different parts of the Greek world with different ways of life and are looking at each other in very much of an unfavorable manner as to what the other city is doing there, why it belongs there or doesn't belong there, and what its role in life is. So bear that in mind consistently as you think about what's going on with these two cities as the Peloponnesian War gets underway. Let's now talk about the military strategies of the two cities. We'll start off with the Athenians. All of this comes from our historian Thucydides, who describes this in great detail and for the most part has relatively positive things to say about the leader Pericles. So the Athenians were at their greatest advantage at sea because of Themistocles' efforts several decades before to build up the navy. That, of course, had served the Athenians really brilliantly well in the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. The Athenians continued to use their fleet to great effect for trade and commerce, for patrolling the Aegean Sea under the Delian League to keep away Persians, and in particular occasions of battle during the First Peloponnesian War against the Spartans, and also when they were trying to deal with the Corinthians against the Corcyraeans in the run-up to the Peloponnesian War a couple of years before with the Battle of Sybota. So the Athenians, therefore, were very well versed in seamanship. Their triremes, which were their ships with 3 banks of oars, were specially designed for very quick, easy, lithe maneuvering. The Athenians, in fact, had several major maneuvers that they could use. 2 of them, the most legendary and most effective, were one called the Diepplus, which was going through like this, all in a line, through the ranks of the enemy ships, and then quickly at a signal being turning in like this in order to be able to ram the ship's broadside. And the other was called the periplus, which was splitting up the fleet like this and surrounding the entire enemy fleet, and then eventually turning in toward the enemy and eventually capitalizing on their weakened state to finally being able get to them and disable their ships. So those were especially feared Athenian weapons. If the Athenians were very strong at sea, they were correspondingly weak on land. So one of Pericles' major tips to the Athenians was, at no point ever should they take on either the Spartans or the Thebans on land. And this was a piece of advice that the Athenians did follow so long as they were overseen by Pericles. But when Pericles passed away in the early years of the war, the Athenians came to forget this piece of advice to their regret, as we will see later as the war continues. So you have the Athenians charged with making sure that they rely only on their ships and never on their land army for any kind of engagement with the enemy. Now, in addition to that, Pericles, aware that the Spartans were going to carry out a scorched earth policy on Attica, the territory surrounding Athens, called in all of the Athenians and the Attic countryside dwellers out of the countryside, supposedly temporarily, to stay in the city, housed with temporary shelter, so that the Spartans would be able to invade the countryside and not kill any of them. But the Spartans, left in this way with a wide open area, of course, were able to go through and pretty much wipe out any kind of possessions and crops and, unfortunately, vineyards and olive trees out in that area. Consequently, Pericles was instructing the Athenians, do not fight, do not challenge them back. This was, of course, quite contrary to the general Greek point of view that whenever a city was attacked, it should immediately defend itself. The Athenians were basically being told, let the Spartans do whatever they want and don't defend yourself. That went down very hard. But the Athenians did it, at least for the first year. Pericles also finally said that much of the spending from the Athenian reserve treasury would be used for arming the fleet to go around and make little attacks all around the Peloponnesus at different harbors here and there in order to gradually wear down the Spartans and Peloponnesians and finally persuade all of them that the Athenians, in fact, were so powerful and so unstoppable that eventually the Spartans would just decide, no, this war is no longer worth our time. We're simply going to have to let it go. So that was the Athenian plan. The Spartan plan, in contrast to that, was designed primarily on land, and it was indeed designed primarily to try to weaken the morale of the Athenians by attacking their countryside year after year after year. To that effect, it was somewhat successful because the Athenians were likely very discouraged watching from the city walls of Athens all of their favorite countryside possessions and pastimes all completely destroyed. If you have a chance to read the comic play Frogs by Aristophanes, which we are covering in a different class, in fact, you will notice a reference by the comic chorus, the actual frogs, about the days that they used to sing out in the countryside. The frogs at this point are down in the underworld, so effectively they're dead, and I suspect that their nostalgic reminiscences of times of singing in the countryside probably reflect the sad memories the Athenians have of happier days when Athenians and other Greeks could carry out dancing festivals out in the countryside that has, for now quite a few years when that play was produced, been ravaged year after year by the invading Spartans. So essentially both sides were really trying to operate more on the basis of attrition for their war strategies rather than direct attack. Both sides believed, incorrectly as it turned out, that the other side's morale would not be that strong, that their resolve would weaken in time, and that all it would take was just a waiting game, basically, of holding out long enough on your end and eventually the other end would finally capitulate and say, that's it, we give up. Didn't happen. Both strategies were actually defective. The Athenians had plenty of resources to draw from their allies, so they were able to dispense with resources from the countryside for years and years to come, quite surprisingly, in fact. And the Spartans really were not affected much by the attacks on the harbors, given that the Peloponnesians really were not all that dependent on sea trade or sea commerce in general. And the Spartans really, although were indeed quite powerful on land, weren't necessarily going to specifically try to target the Athenians directly on land themselves either. So telling the Athenians don't fight the Spartans on land, although certainly useful and a good reminder, wasn't necessarily something that was going to advance the Athenian cause all that far. So both strategies did not really address the morale of the other side all that correctly. However, the biggest defect on either side was on the Athenian side with regarding money. Pericles thought that he had a really large store of reserve financing, about 6,000 talents, that he thought would last for quite a while. He, first of all, failed to take into account how expensive the siege at Patadaia was. And second, he didn't really expect the war to continue for as long as it did. And of course, what did end up protracting the war that nobody was able to anticipate was the plague that we will talk about very shortly in another video. So with those mishaps occurring, contingencies that Pericles didn't plan on, he did not realize that the war was in fact going to be far more expensive, far more costly, not only in terms of money, but also manpower and raw materials, than he really could foresee. And as a result, the idea, again, of waiting for as long as possible on supposedly unending streams of money was in fact chimerical. It did not work out nearly as well as he thought. Okay, so this is how the war gets underway. This is how the war is going to be prosecuted on the two sides. Now we'll start talking about the actual yearly highlights of the war, and where appropriate, we will begin inserting the plays by Euripides. We'll see you in the next video.